Preference utilitarianism is a more recent form of utilitarianism advocated by moral philosophers such as Hare and for a long time until fairly recently Peter Singer. Preference utilitarians argue that we ought to maximise the satisfaction of preferences. Therefore, the morally right action is the one that maximises the satisfaction of preferences, or we could say desires or interests. So we have certain preferences, we all have certain desires, and it is the fulfilment of these preferences and the satisfaction of these desires that constitutes a good life, not merely maximising pleasure. If there is an action that maximises pleasure and some other action that we would actually prefer to do, then we are not wrong to want to go with the action that we would prefer. So, preference utilitarians reject the quantitative utilitarianism of Bentham. They reject the need to calculate the most pleasurable action with the hedonic calculus, and they reject the qualitative utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, specifically the higher-lower pleasure distinction. It is not up to competent judges to tell us which action or activity is best for us. We ought to take seriously the desires of ourselves and others, regardless of the type of pleasure that it is. Preference utilitarianism understands ethical judgments as being subjective rather than objective. So hedonistic utilitarianism sees ethical judgments as objective. That means that they believe there are objective moral facts that are true regardless of what we think about them. But preference utilitarianism is subjective. That is, ethical judgments derive from our desires and interests. And desires and interests cannot be factually true or false, they're just desires. But this doesn't mean that there are no right or wrong answers in ethical decision making. We can logically conclude that my preferences, my desires and interests do not count more than anyone else's. Because there are no factually right or wrong preferences, everyone's preferences ought to be given equal consideration in ethical decision making. Therefore, when we are deciding how to act, we ought to consider how our action will affect the preferences and interests of everyone involved, giving equal consideration to everyone's preferences. The right action, therefore, is the one that maximises the satisfaction of preferences for everyone concerned. As an example, Peter Singer famously argues in Animal Liberation that we ought to take seriously the interests of non-human animals. We ought to weigh, say, our desire to eat meat against an animal's desire not to suffer, and if we conclude, as Singer argues that we should, that the value of our taste buds does not outweigh the suffering and pain that many livestock animals endure, then we ought not to eat meat. That's it for today's video on preference utilitarianism. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.